Hello students, good morning and how are you today? How was your night? I hope you had a good night's rest. Today we are looking again at math and lesson 12. We're in unit 1. We will continue from where we stopped in the last lesson. Our student books and our workbooks, let's make sure we have it with us, and also our pencils and everything we need for the lesson. So again, we are looking at handling data, just like we started the class in the previous lesson. And today we'll be looking at how to read and construct graphs. In the last lesson, we looked more at how to read the graph and interpret the graph. But today, we will try to see how to construct graphs. All right, students, before we start the class, let us do this little warm-up activity. How many axes does a graph have? How many axes does a graph have? In the last class, I mentioned to you about the axis of a graph. So how many axes has a graph got? Just write down the answer and let's see if you will get it correctly. The second question, mention the names of the axes. Mention the names of the axes. So I'll just give you 5 seconds to finish up. Make sure you make an attempt, okay? Just try. And let's see if you get the answer correctly. All right, students, let's check out the answers. How many axes does a graph have? The answer is 2. There are 2 axes on a graph. And what are the names of these axes? We have the horizontal and vertical axis. Now, if you still don't remember, I will show you a graph in the next slide, and I will equally show you where the horizontal and the vertical axis is. Let's go on to the next one. Now look at this. How many axes does a graph have? We have a graph on the screen, and the graph is probably showing us the performance score of some staff of a company because it's saying new employee and 1 year, 2 years. This is showing how many years they have spent and how they have performed in the organization or in the office or in the place of work. Now look at the arrow from the top to the bottom where we have vertical axis. That is describing the vertical axis of a graph. Where you have performance score is the vertical axis of the graph. And where you have the year, maybe the number of years that the staff has spent, is the horizontal axis. Okay? All right, let's go into the lesson now. Now, let's look at our lesson objectives for today. But before I do that, can you see the graph that we have on the screen? Good. Now the graph has 2 axes, okay? Now, even though the graph is inside a box, all right, but then it's got 2 axes for reading the information that it is trying to present to us. When looking at this graph, we could say it's talking about the performance of some employees within a period of some years. We can see new employee, we can see 1 year, 2 year, and 3 years. So this graph must be talking about the performance of employees. Now there's a section for new employees, there's a section of people who have used up to 1 year, there's a section for people who have used up to 2 years and 3 years. Okay, so the vertical axis of this graph is where the performance scores is written, where you have performance score. Okay, and the horizontal axis is where you have the number of years. Okay, now the lesson objective for today is to read and interpret graphs, which we've been doing since yesterday, and we also would look at the information on graphs and see how we can answer the questions. And thirdly, we will try to see if we can construct graphs on our own. I'll guide you into doing that and we'll make an attempt to do that. Now let's get into the lesson. So let's study together, students. Please pick up your student book and open to page 212 to 213. We're still reading graphs just like we did yesterday, and we'll be interpreting the information that we have on the graph. Now we have on the vertical axis number of visitors. This graph is giving us information about visitors who visited the zoo between January and December of a particular year. The year is not mentioned, but the months are in the horizontal axis. We have the months in the horizontal axis and the number of visitors in the vertical axis. Now let's try to answer the questions. It says, how many people visited the zoo in July? Let's look at the horizontal axis and see where we have the month of July. There is a line on the month of July. Let's trace it up to where we have the dots. Now where the dot is, we'll trace it back to the vertical line, and we can see that there we have 40,000. It means in July, 40,000 visitors visited the zoo. The second one says, in which months did 50,000 people visit the zoo? Now we need to go to where we have people, that's the number of visitors, and check 50,000. Now we have 50,000 at the topmost part of the graph, and that is where the dot is, just right on the vertical axis. Now, let us trace the line down. Trace the line down from where we have the dots to where we have the month. The month is January. This means we had 50,000 visitors in January. Please do not make a mistake of tracing the lines that connect the dots. The lines that connect the dots only make you to know the pattern of how people visited the zoo. For example, looking at this graph, I can easily tell that 3 months, 20,000 visitors visited the zoo in 3 different months. The number of visitors who came to the zoo in 3 different months were 20,000, because I can see 3 dots on the same line. And I can quickly also tell that between 2 months, that's September and October, the difference between the number of visitors was very high. Can you see that in September we had 10,000? It's the number of visitors, pardon me, was very low. But when it got to October, it's like there was a really, the line is longer, the connecting line is longer. This states that there must have been a big difference in the visitors who visited the zoo within 1 month. Okay, that is what the connecting line does. All right, it just makes us to be able to take a glance at the graph and tell what has happened. We connect the dots with the number of visitors and the month. Okay, now let's see the third one. It says, how many fewer visitors were there in August than in July? Let's look at August. We had how many visitors in August? Let's connect to the vertical axis, 20,000. And in July, let's see where we have the dots up there and connect to the vertical axis, we have 40,000. Okay, now 40,000 visitors in July, 20,000 visitors in August. The question says, how many fewer visitors came between August and September or July, pardon me? Which one had the higher, or which one had the higher visitors? July, 40,000. And then the one that had the lesser visitors was August, 20,000. Now, what is the difference between 40,000 and 20,000? Great, 20,000. So that answers the questions that lesser people came to the zoo in July, but more people came in August, and the difference is 20,000. Now, between which 2 months did the zoo see the greatest increase in the number of visitors? Now, this is what I explained to you. Now, when we look at the graph, look at where it seemed as if there was so much steep, like there was just a fall in the connecting line. Okay, now it will help you to see the difference between that particular or 2 months. It will help you to see the difference between 2 months. Let's see where we have the steepest. That's what I mentioned earlier, in September. And then suddenly there was just a sharp rise from 10,000 to 40,000, right? Yes. So what's the difference between 40 and 10? 30. It means in September we had 10,000 visitors, but by August we had 30,000 visitors more. Okay, so it would only help you to see that there was a sharp difference here in September and October. The difference between the connecting lines is quite high, right? Okay, now you can look on at the rest, but let's see the last question. I think there's just only one in between. All right, let's see it. It says, between which 2 months did the number of visitors remain unchanged? Between what 2 months did the number of visitors remain unchanged? Now we just look for the two dots on the graph that are the same. Okay, the two dots. I also mentioned it while explaining that I can see, or I can tell that the dots on the same line means that we had same number of visitors in different months. So let's see the months. April, we also had the same number of visitors in May. We equally had the same number of visitors in August, okay? But it's asking which 2 months did the number of visitors remain unchanged. Between April and May, there was no difference. And finally, now, what is the mode of the visitors? If you remember yesterday, I said to you that when you are asked the mode, it means the most frequently occurring number. Which number occurs the most? You will notice that we have 20,000 occurring 3 times, once in April, once in May, and once in August. We also have 30,000 occurring 2 times, once in February, once in June. And look, we also have 40,000 appearing 2 times, once in March and once in July. 50,000 equally appears twice, once in January and once in December. Now, all other months or all these other months have two mode, but we have 20,000 appearing 3 times. That means it appears more than any other month or more than any other number. So, our mode for this graph is 20,000. Okay? All right then. Now let's see the next one.